Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
All right, we're going to wrap up this lesson on dealing with disappointment. We've seen that David had it in his heart to build God's house. God said, you're not going to be the one to do it. Your son Solomon is going to be the one to do it. And what we see next in the life of David is he does his absolute best to set his successor up for success. Now, this is a critical skill that few people have. They can go, yeah, I got a successor, but subconsciously, so many of them sabotage their successor because they want to look good, because it really doesn't feel good when you hand it baton off to somebody and everybody's going, hey, this is amazing. Why didn't we do this sooner? Or, hey, pastor, this guy's a better preacher than you, and you were good, but this guy's better. I mean, who wants to hear that? Like, nobody. I don't, but it's going to happen, okay? So David did his best to set up his son for success. 1 Chronicles 28, we see three things that David did in dealing with disappointment and setting up his successor for success. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 11 and 12. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers, its inner chambers, and the place of mercy seat, and the plans for all he had by the Spirit. Notice this, he gave plans and in writing. One of the most important things you can do at any level of your organization is have your job in writing. Have a manual of what it is you do, why you do it, explaining all of it. And hey, here's ideas I had, and here's how you can succeed going forward. It's one of the most important things you can do. Have your job in writing, put it in a manual. Unfortunately, I have had way too many times, and more than I can count, over 16 years of Element Church history. I'll spend time working with the leader. We establish the job, the function. We come up with manuals. We come up with all these important things. And then somewhere along the line, God moves them on. And then what happened is there was no baton pass of that manual, or the leader that came in and took the job didn't read the manual. And then what happens, I'll walk in like 6 months later and I go, hey, why aren't we doing that anymore? And what happened to that? Well, what happened was either there was no manual that was passed on, or the person didn't use the plans that were already in place. And then there's a bunch of things that are forgotten. And every organization will start mission drift. Why put all this time into reinventing the wheel with every new staff person coming in? Look, if you leave it in writing, you put it there so the next person can come in, and here's what they do. They get to take advantage of the 5 years that you were there building a great system so that they can simply add to it and fine tune it versus going backwards 5 years in that department, starting back over from scratch, and then the pastor or the boss having to have the same conversations over and over and over and over and over and over. And just, I'm going to hit repeat on that and just let that go for about 63 minutes. Okay. But just for sake of time and respect for you, just imagine that's what's taking place. All right. Plans and writing. There's a great book out there called E-Myth. It really talks about the importance of systematizing and putting it in writing. It's why large corporations can move into a franchise model, because it's all systematized. It's all in manuals, and a third grader could read it and run it. That's how you move to a franchise model, which tends to be more profitable over the long run if you're building a company. 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 14, he gave gold by the weight for things of gold, for all articles used in every kind of service, also silver for all articles of silver by weight of all articles used in every kind of service. The second thing he did is he gave financially to God's house. What you'll see is David was an extravagant giver of gold and silver to build God's house. Hey, you know what he gave? He gave to the building campaign, and he was like, I'm all in. Here at Element Church, we call that the Kingdom Builders Fund. Look, David understood that he was blessed to be a blessing. There are some of you that are like kings inside of the world's economy, meaning you're able to build financial empires. You're able to build successful businesses. And remember, not all that is for you. God has blessed you to be a blessing. And there's a great saying, if God can get it through you, God can get it to you. As God's blessing you and as your company is expanding, you be asking God, why is this extra business taking place? Why did we sell that extra whatever? Why did we get this new contract? And be asking God, what of this are you blessing me with so that you can build your kingdom and your God's house? Whatever church you're a part of, know that you're blessed to be part of building that house where you're getting fed because it's taking the gospel into all the world. And we see that in David's life. He was incredibly generous to give to God's house. 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 21. And then he said, here are the divisions of the priests and the Levites for all the service of the house of God. Everything willing craftsmen will be with you for all manner of workmanship, for every kind of service. Also the leaders and all the people will be completely at your command. You know what he did? He left a solid leadership team. He didn't just leave a booklet and a team in disarray. He had a team ready to go. He passed the baton to them and he said to Solomon, hey, they're going to be with you. They're ready to go. I've given you the best of the best, the cream of the crop, and these teams aren't in shambles. You're not going to have to come in and spend 3 months rehabbing this thing or 3 years. They're ready to go. They're going to be at your service. One of the greatest things that you can continually be doing is having a healthy, successful team because you're investing into them. You're pouring into them. And if there is ever a future transition, how you leave that team for the successor reflects on your leadership. I've had some great leaders over the years that God blessed us with for a season, and God moved them to another area inside of his kingdom. And you know what? They left a great team in place. And we didn't have to go in and rebuild. We didn't have to go in and spend 12 months reorganizing and building morale and, rehiring people that left because of a lack of morale. They did a great job. But then I've also had some leaders who when they left, the team fell apart. The team was being held together with like duct tape anyway, and we didn't necessarily see it. And that wasn't healthy. And unfortunately, it reflects bad on them. That's not what they wanted. That's not what they intended, but that's ultimately the reflection. If you're working for a company, you're working for a boss, when it is time for you to leave or it's time for you to get promoted, how you leave that, you want that to be a positive reflection on you. So you be working on your team and you do everything possible to make sure that team is in top shape when you go to pass on the baton. There we have it. We learned some very valuable tips on how to deal with disappointment from David. See you next week in another lesson from David in the All Out Leadership Podcast.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.